One of the things that has always really bugged me was when people see a kid who doesn't have those great social empathetic behaviors, that they kind of view them as almost a sociopath because they sometimes laugh when a kid falls down. Right? But if you, in the context of the game, someone falls down and up comes a text cue that tells you, "Are you okay? Are you hurt? Do you need help?" And you say that, and the voice recognition picks up on that, and you earn. If you say the right things, you earn more crystals. And you practice that in the context of the game, and then you do some out-of-game practice and reinforcement, that all of a sudden you take a kid who doesn't really demonstrate empathy, and all of a sudden they learn to do it in the context of the game, and you generalize it outside the game. You've got a kid who looks and sounds empathetic. Now, do you really want to be empathetic? No, you engage in empathetic responding contextually. And games have the ability to give these kids those same skills, to be able to have the contextually appropriate social behavior to come across as someone's sad and like, "Hey, you okay? What's the matter?" Or they're happy, like, "Hey, you look really happy. What's going on? I love to see you smile." Like, those behaviors are social behaviors that change the relationships between humans, and games can build those skills a heck of a lot easier than any curriculum out there that exists. There is no good social skills curriculum for kids with autism that builds that level of complex social behavior.
All right, guys, I've got an incredibly special guest with us here today. Now, my guest is a world-renowned leader and innovator in the space of applied behavioral analysis. Now, he is one of the founders and a two-time president of the MassABA, the Massachusetts Association for Applied Behavioral Analysis, the VP of Clinical Curriculum and Research at Beacon Services. Dr. Ross received his doctorate in education leadership from Nova Southeastern University, is a co-director of the BCBA certification program at Cambridge College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. He has presented over 100 times in research poster presentations, workshops, symposiums at the ABAI conferences, and continues to innovate in the space with one simple idea: that technology is going to be the answer that will help us face the challenges that we face in our community. Dr. Robert Ross, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you very much, Keenan. Appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely.
And some of those things are past. I'm no longer the director. I've actually moved on from my role, moved from curriculum development at Beacon. I became actually the senior vice president and then the chief clinical officer at Beacon. I was there for about 30 years, and I still am a consultant to Beacon clinically and actually on these issues of technology, innovation, development, and access to services, which is really right now the real challenge for people who work in this space. We don't have enough people to provide these services.
And this is exactly where I want to kind of dive in. You know, with all of your experience that we have in our space, specifically in meeting the demand of our communities, I want to kind of level set for the audience here. Now, one of the things that we recognize in the ABA services space is that more and more children per year are being diagnosed with autism. Just a few years ago, 1 in 56 children were being diagnosed with autism. Today, the number is about 1 in 36 children are being diagnosed with autism. So we're seeing extreme ramp ups and increased numbers of individuals who are being diagnosed, but the level in which we're able to meet the needs from a diagnosis, from a treatment perspective, seems to be really lagging behind that need in our community. So why don't you kind of give the audience a better understanding of the challenge, I guess you would say, that we're facing in our communities, Dr. Ross?
Well, so you hit the nail on the head with the increasing diagnosis, right? We've got more and more kids who meet the criteria, which frankly have changed over the last decades. I mean, I remember it was 1 in 10,000. I remember when it moved to 1 in 5,000. I watched it tick down, and I watched what are the criteria for diagnosing someone with autism shift and change over time, and some categories literally disappear. There are more kids who meet the criteria to have learning and behavioral challenges than ever did before. There's a range of reasons for that. We're probably not going to delve into that today, but the bottom line of that is there's a lot of kids out there that have challenges in learning, in communication, and in challenging behavior, and there aren't enough qualified, trained people to serve them. Before they can get services, though, particularly in an insurance world, and we live in an insurance-funded services world. To be eligible, you've got to get a diagnosis. Access to diagnostic services are in and of itself a separate challenge. The number of clinicians, you think, when you only have to identify 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 1,000, the number of diagnosticians you need is fewer. The number you need when it's 1 in 57 or less, you need a lot more people identifying those kids. And we see just tremendous disparity in the identification of kids. I live here and work in Massachusetts, but I also work all over the world and across the US. And there are places where there just simply aren't the clinicians to do the diagnostic work. So the waiting lists become just unmanageable. You have people who are waiting literally 6 months, 9 months, a year and a half to get access to a person who can say, you meet the criteria and now you're eligible for services. In the meantime, if insurance funds the services and you don't have a diagnosis, you don't have access to early intensive treatment, which is what is going to produce the best outcomes. So you've got literally a generation of kids waiting to get access to services that they can't get. And even if they get the diagnosis, then there aren't enough qualified professionals to provide the services. It's really, if you're a parent and you know your kid is language delayed and has these challenges and you want to get them help, it's a frustrating world because you've got to negotiate getting a diagnosis and then finding a provider. And both of those things, are, depending on where you live, are just nearly impossible or take forever.
One of the things that I experienced with an organization that I work with here in Southern Nevada is called the Grant a Gift Autism Foundation. Now, we have a 6,000 family wait list for services here in Southern Nevada. So not only are we a geographical desert, but we're also a desert for the individuals who need to provide these services to the individuals in our community. And I didn't understand the complexity of the problems until we really sat down and you started describing what were some of the unique challenges that we're seeing in our space, not only from I would say, top of funnel perspective for individuals who are getting certified to be these individuals and these healthcare professionals, but also some of the challenges in adoption of pieces of technology and innovation, I guess you would say, that help us kind of accelerate that roadmap. Before we kind of dive into that, can you give everybody a better understanding of why did you choose this space with all the other things that you could be doing with your excellence, Dr. Ross? Why did we choose to go down this path?
So, I've worked for Beacon ABA Services pretty much most of my career. Early on, I worked with adults with severe behavior problems, and really interesting world to work in. But what happened is, there was this gentleman, actually fairly famous in our world, Ivar Lovaas, who started taking some of the technology of teaching pioneered by people like Skinner and others around learning. And just great early research that showed you can take a person and teach skills in ways for some really challenging learners. And the early applications of ABA weren't with typically developing kids, weren't with even young kids with autism. They were with people with severe behavior problems. And what ABA demonstrated was that you can teach a range of really difficult skills to people who were thought at that time to be uneducable, who couldn't learn. And the technology and the science is so powerful that it could. And Lovaas demonstrated you could take that and take a package of those things and do it intensively with very young kids. And the trajectory of those kids' future from being, quote, uneducable to IQ changes to typical functioning to half of those kids losing the diagnosis in 3 to 4 or 5 years. So all of a sudden, the future of kids with autism went from institutionalization to potential typical development, going to school, having a life. And the world changed at that. It was like one of those great paradigm shifts where all of a sudden we realized, oh my God, we've got to pour effort and resources into early intervention because instead of having, and most states don't really have them anymore, these institutions that were warehousing adults with cognitive and developmental disorders, those places don't exist anymore. They were all shut down. And a part of that is there's no pipeline to those places anymore because early intensive intervention changes someone who's even pretty limited cognitively able to dress and bathe themselves, able to live more functionally in the community. The future, if you were a kid with a disability, and I have a parent who has this wonderful, awful story. I worked with her son who's now in his 20s. He graduated from Pratt University in New York. He was diagnosed with autism at under age 3. And the clinician who diagnosed this child, who was unaware of early intensive treatment, told the mom, go home, kiss your son goodbye while he's still sort of with you, and make plans to institutionalize him. He's never going to speak. You need to say goodbye because your son's gone. And she refused to let that happen. She got a second opinion. Someone said, oh, you need to get early intensive ABA and you need to get it now. And again, this kid's a college graduate, a great pianist, a fantastic artist, has his own life. He has friends, family, people. He was nonverbal and, was at that point, that clinician believed he was never going to, function. That's the power of ABA done early and intensive. And if you're a parent and you have this, oh, that's a possibility for my kid, but I can't get access. Imagine how frustrating that's got to be. And so, at that point, shifting my career to, oh my God, we have got to, and I had the pleasure of meeting a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Littleton. He ran early intervention programs in a school for adolescents with behavioral and learning challenges. And he wanted to set up an early intensive program called Beacon. And that's sort of how I got in there. We went from, there's like 6 of us at the start of it to, over 400 people, and setting up those master's programs to train more people. Beacon also runs a diagnostic clinic because we had to figure a way to get better access to diagnosis for kids. So that became my all-consuming career for the last 30 years of how do we train more people? How do we get access for children and families to high-quality, excellent services? When we're in Massachusetts, it's an education-friendly state. It's a place that supports that, and geographically, it's relatively small. And we struggled to get people into homes because of geographic challenges. Arizona, big states like Texas, I look at other parts of the country and say, oh my God, like we have a concentrated small place and a decent amount of a population, and we struggle to meet the need. The rest of the world is even in worse shape. It's just hard. But it's critically important because we have the ability to change the trajectory of lives for children and families. My line was always, this is somebody's kid, this is somebody's life. It has to matter to you. And if it doesn't matter to you, go do something else. Work at McDonald's, just pick another field. But you have the chance here to change the trajectory of a child and a family's life. How can you not be care about that?
And this is the biggest thing that I think we should call attention to, which is this is an impact of not only a child or a patient, but also their family as well. I speak to so many different leaders today that talk about the need for us to be able to support the whole family through this process. I mean, imagine how frustrating it would be. And I'm just going to echo what you just said. My child is nonverbal. It takes me a year and a half to get a diagnosis. Then I have to wait another year and a half to be able to access services in my community, or maybe I have to move to go somewhere else. That demand and that stress that happens on the overall family as a nucleus in itself is incredibly devastating. And if we don't have access in these different places and these different channels of access, it seems like unless we focus intensive effort into increasing our ability to meet the top of the funnel in our community, we're going to be in trouble for a long time.
Yeah. And the thing is, we can make long-term plans to train more people, clinicians, diagnosticians, and people to do the treatment. But today, they're not here. So today, we need solutions that increase access, increase diagnostic. And that's where, my path led to technology, right? Because we can, the number of training programs for ABA professionals, when I got my master's in applied behavior analysis, there were 13 in the world. There are now over 400. Right? And there aren't enough.
I mean, so can you give the audience a little bit of an understanding of how long it takes for you to become a credentialed, certified ABA individual in the space, an ABA professional?
So depending on which credential we're talking about, sort of there's a sort of entry level, necessarily non-degreed or a high school diploma or even bachelor's degree credential. And you can get training in that and over the course of 30 to 60 days, get the basic ability to work under somebody implementing stuff. But somebody who's supervising you, right? They need a master's degree in either education, psychology, applied behavior analysis, and they have to complete certification coursework, which takes on average about 2 to 3 years depending on the program and the amount of supervision. Um, so it isn't going to happen overnight. And even then, we say that those are the people who have, you know, a minimum amount of training. They have a basic knowledge. They don't have 15 years experience implementing, programs, knowing how to apply and modify stuff. They have a basic knowledge of the science and minimal knowledge of working with children with autism. So, while they're credentialed, they really are the person who can be a lead clinician. They can on paper, but they really need supervision, training, support, mentor, and to work under, skilled, competent people. So the quality of outcomes in that quote certified trained person is still going to be very different than the person who's been working in the field for 10, 15, 20 years and really under because the breadth of literature, which you have to know to work with a kid with autism. You're talking about challenging behavior problems. So how do you treat self-injurious behavior, repetitive behavior? How do you treat aggressive behavior? How do you teach a kid who's not toilet trained to go to the bathroom? How do you teach how to read, write? Do you have any knowledge of teaching kids the skills necessary to become a fluent reader? Well, that's not behavior analysis, right? That's a degree in education. Toileting, feeding, sleeping, all of these issues come up in autism. So the breadth and depth of skills you need to have to be able to treat all of the issues, as well as be competent enough to work with a family, siblings, in a family's home and the dynamics of that. Right? These are all a lot of things we expect clinicians to be able to do. And 2 years, 3 years of training is simply not adequate to have someone who's at the level of skill necessary to do those things fluently. So we've
I
got
mean,
a backlog and a training problem. And, people will say, after 10 or 15 years, I really know what I'm doing. I had minimal competency. And there's always a running joke. It's like people get their credential, they assume like I have a master's degree. I know everything. And like, and it takes you 5 to 10 years to realize, oh my God, I knew nothing then.
I mean, the experience that you gain through interacting, like you said, in all of these dynamic environments is
Yeah.
truly your master's degree, right? Your certification does not prepare you for all the complexities that you just named. Because
Yeah.
when I think about ABA therapy, I'm like, okay, think about this in a clinical environment, at a location, at a facility. But we talk about the dynamics of having to help engage with family members who are at home. All the other things that you mentioned, those are an incredibly complex suite of skills to be able to meet your patient and your client where they are with the needs that they need.
I was talking about that child I worked with years ago. Siblings. He had a sister. We involved her in therapy because if we didn't, she was not going to sort of tolerate all these people coming into their home and not paying attention to her. And so we took great pains to engage her in that. And there's, the literature is replete with stories of siblings who resented all these people coming into their family's home and spending time with their sibling and not with them. And so that's something that a clinician has to be aware of. Like you're going in there, if you're not paying attention and engaging and involving that child, that brother or sister in that in a way that makes them feel valued as part of the family, and that it's not just these people coming in to spend time with my brother or my sister and not me. Kids can come to resent that. There's a lot of stress on parents raising a kid with autism, and the rates of divorce are just through the roof for parents of a kid with autism. So how do you support a family to be able to work together and stay cohesive and hopefully make it? And those are all different challenges than applied behavior analysis.
I mean, you're right. I mean, one of the buzzwords that we've seen in healthcare over the last, I'm going to call it 5-10 years, is whole person health,
Yeah.
right? The recognition that everything is connected. When I hear you talking here, I think about whole family health in
Yeah.
this instance. And so we have to be able to address those needs.
Yeah. ABA is often accused of not looking at the whole child. And I always think that, and I've seen cases where certain clinicians are just focused on, the behavior and not the person, not the family, not the context. But, good behavior analysts have always been about the whole context and the whole child and all of those issues, because you can't be successful going into a stranger's home and working with a kid without understanding all the dynamics of that home and how grandma and grandpa are not involved, issues they have with their neighbors, times of the day that the family um, value being together and doing stuff, or that people need to be alone. And there's just, if you don't understand that context, you're not going to be as successful as you need to be for that child and family.
So, how are we supposed to meet the needs of our communities? How can we look at this problem differently with a lens of curiosity? What are some of the ways in which you're kind of helping to innovate in this space to help us meet the demand of everything that we're talking about here today?
Well, I've had the pleasure of, over the course of my career, I go to these conferences and people are there, presenting research, and learn, and you learn a lot there. But also there are people there who have historically come in and like, we have this data collection system, or we have this product around teaching communication. And I always, take the time to see what's going on here. And I had the pleasure a few years ago of meeting a gentleman who was showing this computer game, and it was designed to be a game that, in the context of the game, if the character was talking, if you looked at the character, it kind of lit up in urine crystals. If you didn't, it stopped talking. And it just, using behavioral technology, shaping and fading and reinforcement to essentially shape looking at faces while they were talking. One of the hallmark deficits of kids with autism is they don't attend necessarily to faces. I'm not a big eye contact, eye gaze guy, but I don't know whether you're ignoring me, happy about what I'm saying, or frustrated with me if I don't look at your face. If I don't attend to those social cues, I could be annoying you, or you could also not be paying attention to me at all, and I can't adjust my behavior. I can't have friendships and relationships if I don't attend to those social cues. So building that skill, which is a core deficit of kids with autism, they don't do that. Like, that's an innovative way to do that. It intrigued me. So, well, at that time, I wasn't ready in Beacon to sort of, hey, let's purchase this, because I wanted evidence that it actually works outside the game. Like, I kind of said to the guy, like, do you have any evidence that the skills learning, like, I could see that kids would look at this in the game. I love it. It makes perfect sense to me. Any evidence that it affects them outside of the game? And so we don't have that yet. And I said, hey, how about you partner with me? We'll do some research on it and we'll demonstrate that it does or doesn't. And if it doesn't, I'm happy to work with you on developing curriculum to get it to do, because we need solutions like that. So we developed this sort of partnership where I didn't work for them, but I liked the idea of it. And over the course of COVID, I continued to communicate with them because our research project got shut down thanks to COVID. And as soon as it sort of ended, we contacted me and we're like, let's go forward with this. And so I've been working with them, helping develop a range of products. One as a measurement tool to be able to see whether it does do this. And in the course of doing that, we figured something out. This, using the computer game, and it's fundamentally predicated on what do you call it? Eye tracking software, something called the Toby. It's an eye tracking device. And so it watches where you're looking. And so, well, what if we actually created a video where we could see where the kids looked at faces? We could have other stuff in there, and we could get a baseline measurement of, did they look at faces, look at other things? And as we started to sort of develop this, we realized, oh my God, if you get typical kids, we get a pattern. Typical kids look at the faces of the speaker. Our kids with autism, when I put some stuff in the background, like, so you can see stuff in my background, that might be attractive to kids with autism. And we started getting these really clear differential patterns where, like, the objects would hold the attention. And when you start looking at the data and duration of where they looked, and I don't know if you're familiar with fMRIs. It's a technology that's brain scanned, and it shows brain activity. And the classic presentation of an fMRI is something called a heat map. So if there's more activity going in this part of the brain, it lights up. The other part doesn't light up because there's not much going on there. So you can see in teaching activities, or even effects of medication, that certain areas light up more than others. Well, in our heat map of where the eyes were looking, you can see characteristically different things. And I thought, wait a minute. You mean in a 1-minute video, you can tell that kid has autism and this kid does not. And so, like, this actually might function as a diagnostic tool. Now, there are actually probably right now 7 to 10 different companies, maybe even more than that, because I'm not aware of probably all of them, that are essentially going down this road and developing diagnostic tools based on eye gaze patterns and heat map technology. And we literally will probably see within the next, I would bet, anywhere from 1 to 5 years, one company already has a FDA cleared diagnostic device to diagnose kids with autism using eye gaze patterns. The market's probably going to become flooded shortly. And actually, since we last spoken, that happened between the time you and I initially met for this and today. It was like 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago that the FDA clearance was announced of this other device. Simple computer screen. Now, think about access to diagnosis now. You can go to a clinic, your kid sits in front of a computer, a video plays, and a couple of minutes later, you have a definitive diagnosis. Yes, autism, not autism, maybe ADHD, maybe differential diagnosis of other issues or some combination, and probably even severity levels. One of the holy grails of autism diagnosis that geneticists have been looking for forever, something we call phenotypes. Differences. We know that autism is a spectrum, right? There's a range of presentations from nonverbal and severely impacted to, actually fairly smart cognitively, really good skills, but socially not. And yet somehow those are the same diagnosis. So we know there's some differences and we haven't been able to identify them genetically. We may be able to differentiate them through visual behavior. And so that differential diagnosis and thus more sort of specialized treatment as a function of that becomes possible. So, to go from you have to wait a year and a half to tomorrow you can go into a clinic and someone with a computer screen and that video setup can give you an answer and get you access now to treatment services. Like that world where the delay or the even inability. I used to tell the story of how in Massachusetts there were no kids labeled or diagnosed with autism in what's called Dukes County, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket in the 80s and early 90s. Until there were services available in Massachusetts for those children and families, no parents took the ferry over to Mass General or to the diagnostic clinics in Boston to get a diagnosis because there were no services. All right, now there's services, and now they got to take the boat over. They get the diagnosis, so there are now children getting diagnosed. But they wouldn't have to do that. They wouldn't have to travel. Like this, it just all of a sudden you want to talk about equity. Availability changes for everybody, regardless of socioeconomic status, ethnicity, anything. Now that can become available across the world, changing speed of access. But what it doesn't change is access to treatment, right? That doesn't change nomenclature. So so we got, all of these wonderful potentials and right now really, becoming true, not just potential anymore, but in the pipeline, realistic change in diagnostic access. Now, treatment. Well, what got me involved in BioStream in the first place, and is actually another company that does this thing called Talkato, communication device. At a conference, and a guy was doing a research project about this simple handheld device that wasn't a tablet, wasn't breakable, but easy for kids to be able to learn to communicate. No difficulty in programming, simple access. Like there are technology solutions out there, and that's what I've found over the last 5 or 10 years, but the last 5, and it's been accelerating. There are really smart people out there coming up with answers to quality of treatment, access to treatment, and the only barrier now is adoption, because the systems and the smart people have figured out ways that we can teach communication, that we can teach eye gaze, that we can actually build improvements in behavior. We can teach skills, social language, communication, core deficits of autism, social interaction. We can teach these things in the context of computers and do it more efficiently. We can do it at a greater frequency. We can do it more. The thing that I like is the accuracy. When a kid's not looking at the character, the eye gaze picks that up right away, stops talking. If you're talking to me and I'm looking at whatever, I may not realize you're not looking at me. If I'm trying to teach you to look at me, I have to contrive a lot of opportunities. It takes a long time, and I have to be really skilled. And I might miss whether you're looking at me or, you might be looking at my glasses or the thing behind me. The computer doesn't miss. The eye gaze technology isn't inaccurate. The devices that function to teach you language give you an accurate model every time. When I was working in Saudi Arabia with a child who had significant language problems, I had a British BCBA who speaks British, so she says free instead of three. I had a Jordanian occupational therapist who has troubles with J's and P's and B's. They're trying to teach language and they're giving different models. And the child had like a nanny who was from the Philippines. Everybody said the sounds differently, and he was struggling. We got a hold of this Talkido device and things like that. That consistent, technology can give you a consistent model. You model that a few times, he imitates that. His imitation skills were good. The thing he was imitating was humans inconsistently giving, wrong and also judging that what he said was correct when it might not be. Technology, and particularly artificial intelligence, has the ability to fix all of those things. But we have to get it broadly disseminated. And that to me is like the mission now. It's like we as a field, particularly in behavior analysis, has an obligation. If we truly care about these children and families who don't have access, we've got to find ways to disseminate. We've got to identify those effective technologies and get them in the hands of the 6,000 people on a waiting list. Those people could get access to computer-based technology and get practice guided through a distanced person and have some support and get moving before they can get maybe more intensive services down the road when we have more clinicians. But is it nothing until they have something, or is it something that can augment and maybe even help them get more and get good stuff while they're waiting for the world to catch up? And we can't sacrifice these generations of kids. We don't need to. We got to figure out how we get technology from these really smart people who develop cool stuff to the people who actually need to use it. And that's, I think, our next sort of phase here, which is adoption, right? There are so many barriers to adopting technology.
Dr. Ross, I want to reverse a little bit and kind of give the audience a better understanding of why does the video game gamification make so much sense for this demographic of a client or patient specifically? I really want to hit on that.
I'm glad you did that because it really, I probably gave it short shrift and it matters because, first of all, kids with autism, I would say, are often uniquely designed. People look at autism in a lot of different ways, and I don't look at autism as a disorder. I look at if you've got a brain that processes visual information really well, and you learn from visual information, but the rest of the world wants to teach you as if you're a great language learner, you will do poorly, not because of anything other than the world wants to teach you in a way you don't learn. Visual information. I know that I can walk into almost any house with any kid with autism at whatever age, and if that kid has a favorite thing, it's the favorite thing's a doll, a toy, an object, and I can take their hand, take that object, and walk with them in this house that I've just walked into, go down a hallway, up a set of stairs, another hallway, into a room, open a closet door, put that item down. I'm with the kid. Go back downstairs. Never said a word. That kid in one teaching trial will go right back. They'll have learned that route, remember a multi-step task, do it independently, correct the first time. One trial learner, complex cognitive task. And yet people are having trouble getting him to do and not do simple things. And what I did was take language out of the instruction and used a potent reinforcer. Games work that way. They're visual. They don't sit there and go blah, 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 blah. You press this button, this happens. You press another button, it doesn't happen. Like, ever watch a kid with autism use a phone? They don't make 16 mistakes trying to turn it on. They know it works and they don't do the wrong thing. The speed, the efficiency, the clarity of their learning is a function of how games and video games and computers work. They are ideally designed as an instructional format for kids on the autism spectrum, in my view. So now you take that video game and it shapes, it uses behavioral technology to shape. So, one of the things that early on the studies of the BioStream Lookware games was that these kids, as soon as they realized if I looked faster, I got more crystals. And if I didn't look, I didn't. You literally, kids are commenting, I got all the crystals. Like, they knew how many they could get, and they wanted to get the maximum amount. They didn't want to do poorly in the context of the game. They wanted to win. And particularly, a lot of the kids that I work with who are, have language skills a little bit older, they want to win. They don't like losing. They think of themselves as smart. So doing wrong things in the context of game, not interested. Doing wrong things socially, perfect. You know what that happens? People don't make me social. If I don't look at you, you'll stop looking at me and stop talking to me and go away. I win that game. The video game doesn't operate that way. Winning is looking, paying attention. In fact, one of the really neat things about the emotion recognition thing is character starts talking, face is completely blurred. And you have to discriminate what emotion they're feeling. If you keep looking at the face, the eyes unblur and you can see the eyebrow position. And if you keep looking, the mouth unblurs and you can see whether they're smiling or they're frowning. Right? So you can discriminate emotion. And to win the game, be correct, you have to attend to faces. Like, it's just so efficient, so fast, so easy, so consistent with the learning sort of modalities and strengths of our kids that, we move from kids who are avoiding eye contact in sort of typical social situations, because if mom looks at me and I look at her and she's talking and I keep looking at her, she's going to ask me more questions and drag out this social interaction. I don't prefer it. It's not my strength. I'm not interested. If I look away, she'll leave me alone. And so we don't realize that often kids who don't prefer that get punished if they keep looking and get rewarded if they look away. And we're surprised that they look away. We're frustrated rather than say, look, how do we set up so that there's value for them and that we don't make this an aversive activity for kids? Because you'll hear many adults with autism say that looking at faces is aversive. And, there's no physiological reason that it would hurt, but there's a really good, environmental reason why it would be punished if you continue to do so. So if it's not your strength, not your interest, you learn the behavior that ends it for you. We got to make it so that it isn't so aversive, and the skills to end it that aren't just looking away, but looking and saying, all right, I'm all done talking now. Teaching games can teach you that. They can teach those social skills. And that's why the game format to me is one of the most promising things for us to understand, that we can set it up so kids win on their terms for the behavior that is really in their long-term social skills interest. So many kids, and if there's one thing you'll hear over and over again with a lot of adults, like, they don't have friendships, they don't have those relationships, and they want them, but they don't want them on our terms. They want them on their terms. And we have to be better about understanding how we, change our sort of frame of reference about what is, appropriate social skills. Right? You don't need to be stared at somebody's eyes. That's weird. But you do need to know if you're talking about the same topic over and over again and it bores that kid, and so they are not interested, so that you stop doing that and shift to something else, so that you don't take someone who otherwise might want to be your friend and annoy the heck out of them so they don't want to be around you. And picking up on those social cues is a hard thing to teach.
In our previous conversation together, you had mentioned another use case for this. You said, think about a gamified system that, in an example of this game setting, somebody's on the ground asking a question, are you okay, will release crystals and gamify and or positively reinforce that behavior. So it's so much farther and so much larger than just eye contact in making, I would say, social recognition, right?
Exactly. It's one thing to recognize that someone's happy, sad, or angry, but what we really want is emotion responding. Like, one of the things that has always really bugged me was when people see a kid who doesn't have those great social empathetic behaviors, that they kind of view them as almost a sociopath because they sometimes laugh when a kid falls down. Right? But if you, in the context of the game, someone falls down and up comes a text cue that tells you, are you okay? Are you hurt? Do you need help? And you say that, and the voice recognition picks up on that, and if you say the right things, you earn more crystals. And you practice that in the context of the game, and then you do some out-of-game practice and reinforcement, that all of a sudden you take a kid who doesn't really demonstrate empathy. and all of a sudden they learn to do it in the context of the game, and you generalize it outside the game. You've got a kid who looks and sounds empathetic. And I always like to use that example of, when you're with someone who you don't like and they fall down, you might think they're a jerk, but you say, "Hey, you okay?" Because you have good social skills. Now, do you really want to be empathetic? No, you engage in empathetic responding contextually. And games have the ability to give these kids those same skills to be able to have the contextually appropriate social behavior to come across as someone's sad and like, "Hey, you okay? What's the matter?" Or they're happy, like, "Hey, you look really happy. What's going on? I'd love to see you smile." Like, those behaviors are social behaviors that change the relationships between humans, and games can build those skills a heck of a lot easier than any curriculum out there that exists. There is no good social skills curriculum for kids with autism that builds that level of complex social behavior, because it seems too hard for people to conceptualize. But in the context of a game, you can come up with 100 examples in a video game where someone gets hurt and you say the right things and you earn more, where someone is happy and you comment on that and you earn more, right? That someone literally is injured and you offer help.
I want to use a little bit of contextualization here for the audience to recognize how powerful gamification elements are at influencing your behavior. So a couple years ago, there was a documentary that came out called The Social Dilemma. And it talked about how powerful things like social media are because they have gamified elements built into them to increase engagement and keep you coming back to the platform. Everybody who has a social or a mobile device today and has social media on their phone will consistently go back to their device time and time again and open up Instagram or Facebook or one other platform that they have because of the gamified elements that are inside. Random release of rewards,
Yep.
aka likes, notifications, the dopamine release that you get from those tiny interactions over a consistent time period is a gamified element that keeps you coming back to this behavior time and time again. And so we're talking about the exact same thing here and using gamified elements to I would say, increase and improve social elements and behavior through gamified elements, which is incredibly powerful. And I wanted to make that connection so people could understand that you are
Yeah.
playing games every
Those
single
likes,
day.
those
Those like
crystals, right? Though that winning, that getting something that I want, and it matters. And the thing is, computers and games do that better than any other format in the world. That's why everyone is tied to their screens. Like, people spend more time in those worlds. And what we want a kid to want to get those skills. To me, there's nothing more inappropriate than coercively trying to make a kid like something they don't. But you can very subtly shape an interest that already exists into the service of skills that we know kids, if they have and want, can change the quality of their lives and their ability to interact. And that matters because there are a lot of kids on the spectrum as adults who are pretty solitary, and like their only interactions are in the computer world. They don't have friends in real life. I literally got a text message this weekend from a friend, in another state, asking for help because his 25-year-old doesn't leave the house, has no friends, no social skills, no, and he knows the kid wants, but doesn't know how to get it to him. And so his whole life revolves around being on the computer alone in his room. And he expresses dissatisfaction with that, but doesn't have a path out.
but also doesn't recognize how powerful the consistent reinforced behavior is being impacted by those computer games and everything else, giving them the satisfaction of reward and engagement and consistent, I would say, community, because he's often probably playing with other people on those platforms, right?
Correct.
And
See,
so
the social
there's a really
community exists.
100%.
It's there. And there's there's actually a few now, even some of the video games and using AI, that are creating virtual communities for kids on the spectrum and older adults on the spectrum to try to shape more, both in the context of their game, social behavior, to practice it that would serve outside. These are things that technology can do and games can do that bring someone to a clinic in a university autism research site will never be able to do.
I want to talk a little bit about, you used a word consistency in this conversation a couple
Yeah.
times. And in our previous conversation, we had talked about some of the subjective nature of diagnosis that comes when we're not using a standardized, consistent system. Let's kind of dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. One of the things that I think people don't always recognize that autism is not diagnosed based on some sort of what we call a biomarker. There's not a blood test, right? So what happens is you go to a clinician. That clinician was trained by somebody, and maybe their previous background was working with kids with ADHD. And so that's the population they know, but there's a need for more diagnosis. So they often will see that kid through the lens of ADHD, and they may or may not get a diagnosis of autism from that particular clinician who will say, oh, no, that's not autism, it's ADHD. Then they go to see somebody else who primarily works with kids with autism and say, oh, no, that's autism. And who's right? The responses to the test and the behavior were the same that both clinicians saw. The kid isn't different. The diagnosing clinician is different. Now, the thing about biomarkers like blood tests, and this is where the FDA has declared eye gaze a biomarker, right? That we can get definitive. Like every time when you see someone who's spending their entire time looking at objects and not at the faces, that's different than typical kids. And so, particularly with AI, you're going to be able to say, here's the line. This is the gray area. Anything on either side is or isn't. And so, there are already studies talking about 90%, 95% accuracy in diagnosis using eye gaze technology. It takes away the subjectivity of a clinician's training, background, experience in making that diagnosis. I think I was telling you, I used to do something called the ADOS when I was working in Connecticut. They used it as an educational classification for autism, but it's the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale. And it's a couple of iterations of it, but it's considered to be the gold standard. If you're going to do NIH-funded research on kids with autism, then you're going to have everyone have an ADOS to demonstrate that they in fact have autism. And it's a pretty subjective tool. My sort of story was I'd see a kid at 12 months, 16 months, even 18 months. And on some aspects of the test, they would make eye contact with me. I could see them not making eye contact with mom and dad when they called. But when I was using certain activities and doing activities, they would look at me. And so their eye gaze and their response, even to what we call joint attention, wasn't bad. But I could also see it wasn't great. And, there were kids that I would see 6 months, a year later, and they wouldn't make eye contact with me and they wouldn't engage in joint attention, that you could see it devolve. And, I got to the point where I was actually did pretty good at being able to say, if I see this kid again in 6 months, they're probably going to, they don't meet the criteria today. They don't today. But I'm pretty certain they will in a little while. They will learn to get better at not looking at people as they continue to get social demands and not respond to them and get reinforced by not having to do stuff. And being able to discriminate. The yelling is when I have to attend. Talking, I can disregard that. It doesn't mean, come here. You need to come here. Oh, okay. And they learn to discriminate. Right. And, the ability of kids on the spectrum to discriminate how adults will behave in their environment is one of those great skills that people sometimes miss. You see differential responding from different people. If I consistently say it one time and make you do it, to me, you might respond pretty reliably to the first instruction. If I repeat the instruction 17 times and then give up on you, you learn to disregard my language. And that's not autism. That's just good learning.
Right.
You see that in typical kids, by the way. You see that in typical kids as well. So it's an interesting thing, but it speaks to the problem, which is that isn't a great measure because it may be measuring learned behavior and not some medical diagnostic intrinsic condition of the individual. Where eye gaze, that's more likely to be an intrinsic characteristic of the individual. Blood, you either have the virus, you don't have the virus. Like there are tests that's why we do diagnostic tests. We're trying to do, you're pregnant, you're not pregnant. We know that if these things are present, you are, or if they're not, you're not. Autism has suffered from the absence of that, the subjectivity. It's actually resulted in a lot of kids not getting access to services because there are clinicians whose job it is to minimize, for instance, if you work for an insurance company doesn't want to fund services, your clinician can say they don't meet the criteria, where someone else says they do, and now it's a difference of opinion because there isn't an objective standard, and that's a real problem.
And that combined with the despair, if you will, of the family who is looking for a specific diagnosis, if they don't have access to multiple perspectives of that diagnosing healthcare professional, then they're going to take the first one that they get. And so when you talk about like ADHD as an example versus autism, I would be really interested to kind of think about the impact on the family of like, we've waited forever for this diagnosis. We're not going to go through the cycle again. So let's just go down this path of the first diagnosis that's given to us, but it is subjective, like you talked about, which
Well,
creates a little bit of
the
a scary future.
the interesting sort of converse of that is there are clinicians who recognize ADHD doesn't get your kid and your family any help.
Mm,
So I don't care what your presentation is. I'm saying autism because getting someone in your house who can teach your kid, who can help shape, new skills and new behavior, whether it's ADD, ADHD, or any other condition, just a behavior problem. If I give you the diagnosis of autism, then people can come in and help you. And so one of the other problems is, all of a sudden we have all these kids meeting the diagnostic criteria that may or may not,
hmm
because that's the only way the clinician has for getting help to the family. And if you're a clinician and you know this label, that family gets help. This label, they don't. You know, yeah, that seems like they have that. Like you can see the pressure that some clinicians would be under to say it's close, but I'm going to err on the side of, and maybe down the road you get reevaluated, and maybe you don't, but you got the help you needed early on.
I want to throw out two statistics. So earlier in our conversation, you mentioned with this new gamified eye tracking biomarker way of diagnosis, we're seeing upwards of 90% accuracy with our diagnosis. As of 2023, 90% plus of children over the age of 2 play video games. So we've got high 90s in both of these
Yeah.
statistics. Why are we dealing with some of the challenges of adoption when we have so many people engaging with this modality of gamification? We see great diagnosis data that's coming out as well. Why would we see any type of any type of adoption, I would say, challenges as we move forward in this space with this new tech?
So you hit on the interesting thing, which is who. Why we see challenge in adoption? Well, who has to adopt it? So you could look at it two ways. If I'm a old school psychiatrist, neurodevelopmental pediatrician, um, and I'm getting insurance reimbursement for doing that, why do I need to change?
Mm.
Right? And by the way, I'm of a certain age. People of my generation may not always readily adopt new technology. Right? Yeah, kids at age 2, 90% of them using computers. Ask how many people in their 50s, 60s are really comfortable just adopting brand new technology to change how they do their job fundamentally. Like that's a barrier, right? So in terms of, you can have lovely, great technology out there, but if the people who have to use it are I don't want to say Luddites, but are just not comfortable adopting, they're not early adopters. Right? That's probably a gentler way of saying that. They're not early adopters, and I work in a field that is overwhelmingly um, probably female. I'd say that like at Beacon, probably 80% of our staff, maybe 75 now, was female and younger. Um, Most of them were not video game people in their early youth. Like
So
I'm doing a
true.
research project now with a company in New Jersey, and the two people who are using the software have never played video games. The gamification part of it, the game controller is the Xbox controller. They don't know how it works. We have to teach them and get them comfortable with a device with which they are literally unfamiliar. Where we showed it to the sort of sibling, I'm sorry, the son of the director. He's a 20-something-year-old guy. He was on that thing cranking around. I love it. He was having a great time because he's comfortable in that. So the sort of target audience of adopting technology has to be people who are comfortable adopting new technology. If you want to speed technology, one of the things that
Mhm.
at the BioStream, the sort of challenge is like we're looking for like early adopters, people who we know are interested in technology or comfortable. changing, what they do, who've adopted some of the computer-based data collection systems, some things that suggest that they are comfortable making moves in that direction, because not everybody is. One of the things that I constantly say to the sort of development team and the leadership at BioStream and the other place that I work with is that you have to identify these barriers, and you have to find a way to overcome each and every one of these. Like if they don't know how they're going to fit it into their center, and they have to figure it out, they're not going to use it. One of the most depressing things that my wife's a speech and language pathologist, and commonly used in kids with speech production issues, or kids who are nonverbal or really significantly challenged. There's a lot of computer-based devices out there, some great augmentative alternative communication, AAC devices. Now, problem is you have to program them. And so somewhere about, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, someone did a study on the devices in the first 6 months of implementation and a year after start of implementation. And it was utterly depressing, and I've got the exact number, but basically they were being used about 90% less than in the first month or two. Some cases not being used at all. Not because they didn't work, not because they didn't help the kid communicate, but because having to reprogram them all the time because the child's communication changed and the needs changed and the structure of language, like it's just hard. And it became a difficulty and a barrier. Like, if you got even an iPad device where you have to have all of these pages set up for communication and you have to organize it all the time and new words come in, and it's work. So unless it intuitively does that or does it automatically, if AI can fix it, so you could say, here are the ones that need to be in there, and it just you might get people to use it. But if they have to jump in and spend an hour of time they don't have on their caseload that's too big, and too many kids who need services, and insurance doesn't fund that, then it isn't going to happen. So the thing we have to really recognize as a field and in general is technology is hard for a lot of people. That the kid may love it, but if the adult who has to turn it on, make sure the calibration's been done, and that you're in the right kid, so you don't have the data isn't being confused. We don't have a HIPAA violation, and there's like process that they have to walk through, or they can just keep doing whatever they're doing, and they don't have to worry about that. Well, that you can see how that can happen.
This is why the product in today's consumer behavior of society matters more than anything. If I had to go through 25 different steps to order an Uber instead of just calling a taxi, Uber never would have got off the ground. But 3 clicks, I drop my location, it comes to me. The elimination of friction is so important in every area of product development and consumer behavior, because like you're talking about, this is a 2-pronged problem. The writing is on the wall. 2023, 90% of children over the age of 2 are playing video games. I cannot say the same thing for the clinicians that we have in the space who are delivering the services at this point in time. And so it's like stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's a really interesting
I might argue
time
the reverse is true. 90% of the staff who are providing the services probably don't play video games. It might be closer to 80, but I mean, it's a big number.
I mean, so how are we supposed to attack this problem? Right? I mean, like you said in the beginning when I gave the intro, technology is the answer for us meeting the demand of the challenges we're facing in our community, but we have slow adopters who are on the front line delivering our services. And so is this a longer term play that we think with a longer time horizon of introducing this technology in the education certification process? Or do we just wait and plant our flag in the ground and say, this is the answer, everybody's going to catch up? But that seems at the dire need of our communities and the families of people who we're trying to meet.
So there's, to me, one of those things of, I like competition being a driver. Right now, the autism space is a crazy competitive environment. You've got venture capitalists coming in and buying up companies and trying to hire all of the BCBAs. Everybody's looking for the edge, the advantage to try to keep themselves viable. And so what you really need is a few early adopters in those areas showing that that's a marketing advantage. We have this measurement and diagnostic tool, and we have this game that increases the amount of basically therapy your kid gets. That makes the outcomes better if your kid's getting served by us. So you want your kid being served by us because we have access to this. And the other ones say, we fall behind if we don't adopt this. And so we're going to have to overcome our fear, our barriers, our concerns, and get on board to doing the thing that, again, ultimately the answer is anything that actually produces better outcomes for kids is going to attract parents. And that's what if you're a provider, right now, Massachusetts, a kid gets under 3 gets a diagnosis of autism, they get handed a piece of paper of the 12 or 15 or 20 different providers in their region who can provide. Now, that isn't true everywhere in the world, but that is here. So they got to pick. Who are they picking? They go online. They do their level of research. But if you've got clear data showing better outcomes than all of the other providers, for the parents who want their kid to get the best possible outcome, it's a no-brainer. So we've got to make sure that the evidence of effectiveness is what drives it.
And this is a really interesting space to be in, because your ability to tell your story, share data and evidence of why this is less of a challenge, easier access, quicker responses, better treatment plans, better outcomes, is becoming the competitive edge. And this is why I love the fact of technology in this instance doesn't need to be looked at as a replacement, which a lot of our later adopters might think about, but an accelerator on how you're going to help to be able to do more, if that makes sense.
We like to use the word adjunctive therapy, right? It's in addition to what you get. And I would say, I have a military past, so force multiplier, right? You've got X number of hours of treatment, but now you've got a kid who likes to play video games, who is motivated to do it. There's the phrase we also use called happy, relaxed, and engaged. Sometimes kids in ABA sessions are unhappy, not that engaged, distracted, and frankly unhappy when it's a bad session or a bad therapist. One of the keys for us is we want kids to be happy, relaxed. We want a kid who's asking, "Hey, can I play that game?" and is playing the game with a smile on their face and they're getting therapy that supports the skills that are critical, that are really core deficits of autism. I would say autism is not a disorder of academic delay. And a lot of people want to work on discriminating colors, letters, and numbers because the format is easy and you can train even less skilled people to do it. It doesn't address social skills and social behavior, which are core deficits of kids with autism and where they struggle the most. And the reason is because people are not good at it. It's hard to do. Now we've got a solution that actually addresses the real issues in a way that is actually consistent with the strengths and interests of our learners. It should be a no-brainer. Why not adoption? Well, because it involves technology that is perceived as difficult, and we got to make sure the perception is like, people buy an iPhone, they pull it out of the box and turn it on and it works. Like, one of the things that Apple has done well is make it easy for the user. We've got to do the same with any technology solution. Anything that involves multiple steps and difficulty decreases adoption, decreases use.
I want to spend a couple minutes here as we start landing the plane, if you will, and talking about the difference, if you will, between the technological world that we live in. So I'm going to reference back to the story that you talked about. You received a text message, a 25-year-old is more engaged in the digital world than in the outside world. And their parents and or whoever was looking after them was a little bit concerned. What if I told you that the average 18-year-old today spends about 9 hours of their time awake on their device behind the screen? If we extrapolate that out through their life, it equals 24 years of their life will be spent on screen time for the rest of their life. Okay. The one thing that I recognize today is that the digital world is becoming more and more engaging and optimized for our attention than the regular world that we live in. Over the recent years, we've also seen an incredible increase in the amount of people who have either been diagnosed or identify as being ADHD. What do you think is going on in the world? Is it we're seeing more people who are having these disabilities, or is it more so that the world that we're living in isn't as optimized for garnering attention and keeping us engaged through the gamified elements that we've talked about today, which kind of leads to that over reliance or that over self-diagnosis of ADHD like we see on TikTok and Instagram and everywhere else?
Yeah, again, ADD and ADHD are those subjective, right? If you can spend 5 hours on a video playing a video game, sitting in that chair, staring at the screen, paying attention to all of these things, do you have an attentional problem?
Doesn't seem like it to me.
If you're out of the game, And you're in a world that frankly doesn't have as many immediate reinforcers and things that attract your attention and pay you off in the same way. So you're not interested in that environment. In my world, that's not a disorder. You don't have a disorder. You have competing environments. And when I'm in a place that is boring, I want to do something that's not boring. Like, do I have a disorder now because the current environment is deficit of things that interest me? Like, now the reality is most people grew up in a world where those interesting and immediate reinforcers weren't present, so we learned to tolerate boring environments. In some cases, come to enjoy sitting back on the beach and doing nothing. Now, my wife will tell, I'm not good at that. I need to read a book. I want to dig a sandcastle with the cat. I need to be doing something. Now, is that a disorder, or that I have learned to find engaging in other things produces more reinforcement for me, so I engage in those things? Um, you know, it's true that the world has changed, and aspects of the world deliver short bursts of dopamine and for little behaviors, lots of them, frequently. And so you become accustomed to that. And when you're in an environment that doesn't do that, you kind of want to get out of that environment and get to an environment that does. Now, whether we as a society think that's a good idea or not is a different issue, but it is simply true of the world that our kids are growing up in and live in now. I don't think pathologizing differences in the world is a good idea. Now, in the same way that I can get a kid to learn a skill that they didn't, we can take kids who didn't read and teach them to read. We can get kids who didn't speak a language to learn a new language. We can do lots of things in teaching. If I'm crappy at golf, you can work with me and I can get better at swinging a golf club or playing basketball. Right? And if we stop pathologizing these conditions and thinking them simply as, we probably need this kid to practice being able to sit still and do nothing. And as a skill, if they practice that, they could probably get better at it. And if we think of it that way, we don't need medication for ADHD. We need some different skill set and practice. And like in my world, that's eminently doable. No one considers me to be, well, maybe a couple friends, but I don't have golf disorder as a formal diagnosis. Now, my golf game might suggest that maybe I should, but there isn't a medication I'm going to be put on for that. I want to get better at that. I got to play. I got to practice. And if I do that, I can swing more controlled and carefully. I can hit the ball better. I can do things differently. One of the things I was talking with the BioStream people about, I want to get a USB mat that plugs into the computer game, and it sits on the chair, and the kid, if they're sitting still without fidgeting for longer periods of time, they earn more crystals or more points, access to other games. Like, could you get them better at sitting still? Like, could you increase the duration of the language information provided while sitting still to build those skills? And are you curing ADD and ADHD, or are you simply building skills? And to me, this is what games could do that no teacher, classroom, or medication can ever do as efficiently, as effectively, as consistently. You can literally have that AI algorithm that knows where you finished last time, starts you off just a little less than that to get you back into reinforcement, and then systematically increases the duration of both the language and the sitting still requirement to earn the crystals or points or the next game that you want to play.
It seems like the answer is right in front of us. And
Yep.
You've done an amazing job of laying it out and saying, this is how we can use gamification, positive reinforcement to reinforce the behaviors and the skill sets that we're looking to develop that help us all be better humans. In our previous conversation, I talked about a book called Indistractable. And the author of that book was talking about the prevalence of ADHD diagnosis today and how we don't have the skill set of regulating our own emotions. Because whenever we get into an uncomfortable situation, what does everybody do? We pull out our device, which has a gamified element behind it, which means as soon as I log on to Instagram, I could have some likes or some hearts or some comments, and those things reinforce.
Or just a video that amuses me, leading to another video like that amuses me, that the algorithm is feeding me.
I mean, it's a really interesting time. I want to use our last couple of minutes here. So let's talk about kind of the future from your perspective as we recognize technology is developing incredibly quickly and changing the landscape? Earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned that the FDA just made a recent, I would say, improvement in using these biomarkers as a tool, or eye tracking as a biomarker for the specific tool that we talked about. What are we
They've
thinking over the
approved the
next?
device to do diagnostics, which is,
Incredible.
yeah, huge.
So that happened in the last 2 weeks. What
Yep.
are we thinking about, let's say, the next 2 years? If you had to rub your crystal ball, Dr. Ross, and say, this is where I think we're going, what are we thinking that we're going to see?
I think we're going to see probably there's at least 15 to 150 companies out there using AI and using game technology to teach skills. And the question of how they get them into places is really in the next 2 year question. Every time I go now to an ABA conference, the number of vendors selling technology based solutions as augmentative supports for social skills, communication, problem behavior, identifying data collection, anything to make the clinician's job easier. It used to be the only technology I saw at an ABA conference was companies selling software for billing and data collection. And now educational related software and computer stuff is now expanding dramatically. The biggest question is what's it going to take to get companies to bite? Because the model, if you've got to buy it, you're an ABA provider. Do I buy this technology now? And will I've invested all this money in it? It'll be obsolete in a year and a half, and there'll be new, better version. So do I hold off and wait for that? Do I spend money? All right. Do I, get the parents to buy it for us? All right. Do we wait till it's insurance reimbursable and insurance pay? Like the funding models for these devices is probably going to be the tipping point. Which way? Because I've already seen one set of devices that went with a FDA approval for some educational related stuff, trying to get insurance reimbursement, and it takes too long. They haven't got it, and now they're rethinking their whole business model. Technology is cool, but they haven't figured out how to get people to buy it. And that to me is a challenge for every device. When I talk to the communication people on their device talking, love it, but somebody's got to fork out some money and then manage it and run it. What if it's insurance reimbursable? Well, okay, so you got a piece of that, but insurance pays for it. Who's managing it? And so same thing with the games. Is the parent buying it? Is the center buying it? Is the school system buying it? Who's responsible? And what about upgrades? All of those are technology questions and problems. And you got your phone. Are you worried about an upgrade? Probably not, because you're going to
Not
get
anymore.
software upgrade automatically, right?
Yep.
And at some point, you're going to be deep enough in it, and it's getting old and a little slow, and you're ready to upgrade. And you're going to get some deal from your provider, right? That problem is solved for phones. Computers, people keep an old computer for a long time as long as it's not working. But educational software doesn't, and computer, that kind of stuff is a big outlay of expense, and people need a reason to say, yeah, I'm willing to spend that money. So who does? It's not the clinician who has to use it, who might not want to use it. It's some administrator who has to say, is that a cost-effective way to spend our dollars?
I wonder if there's an opportunity to kind of think about how this technology can improve itself. A great model that has really kind of taken an industry by storm that we haven't seen before is Tesla cars, right? I have a Model Y, and the one thing that I've loved about having that piece of technology is they have something called over-the-air updates. So every single year at Christmas time, they release a big update, and your car has new features and capabilities that it didn't have before because of the power of software updates combined with the hardware that is pretty much commoditized today.
Yeah.
And so if we build it one time really well and we future cast with software updates the improved capabilities of this technology, that could be a good answer where we can kind of meet in the middle, if that makes sense, to be able to deploy this piece of technology into the hands of the people who truly need it. Because I don't think we have the ability to drag our feet and wait for, I would say, insurance reimbursement to solve this problem for us.
Yeah, that can't be the path, because basically it means it's not available now. And frankly, relying on insurance to pay for things. Um, right now, if you're diagnosed with autism in Massachusetts, insurance will pay for an iPad.
Mm.
Now, what's it used for? Video games and music and YouTube for young kids.
You're exactly right.
It's really, it has the potential to be used for other things, but it's really not used in that way because those are easy and highly reinforcing. We've got to find a way to same model, because the Tesla model is my phone. I got an update last night. Like, I think my computer got updated the other day as well. Like, it just happens, right? And people might have issues with Elon's politics, but everyone I know who has a Tesla has been raving about it ever since they got it and still do.
Yeah.
Right? Because it works.
That's
It's
right.
inexpensive, works, and you don't have to do a lot to keep it working. And that's the technology problem. The early experiences with most technologies, for most, particularly educational systems and provide, at some point when the computers first came out, schools got these grants to get Macs, and every school had a Mac. A lot of them sat there unused for years. So just getting them isn't always enough. Like, if you can overcome that barrier, you still have the who's using them and for what.
Maybe we need to come up with a gamified reimbursement bonus, if you will, for all of our ABA professionals who can start getting, increased reimbursement rates if they're using technology that helps them be more, effective and creating access and diagnosis opportunities for the communities that they serve. Maybe there's ways in which we can carve it up that way.
I like that thing, because I would actually say that one of the innovations that has been discussed a lot in certain ABA circles is differential reimbursement for better outcomes.
Mm.
Kids will make progress faster. Programs and agencies that adopt models that result in better, faster outcomes for kids should get differential pay. And because there's a lot of crappy providers out there whose kids have the same goals and objectives forever, and that should be diminished. Like, unless you reinforce and pay off quality and better outcomes, you don't necessarily get them. You'll get them from the small boutique providers who just simply won't do anything but high quality. But as the market sort of becomes saturated with the venture capitalists, and it becomes about growing and not outcome, I think we run that risk. But hey, if you find out tomorrow you could get a 20% or a 25% bump in your rates of reimbursement if kids meet these following markers in 6 months instead of 9 months, and if they do it in 3 months, then it bumps up to even more. Because all that does is result in better access and better outcomes. So why wouldn't they?
I completely agree. I think once again, Dr. Ross has laid out the game plan here. Now it's our job to be able to figure out how we execute on this plan. One of the things that I've loved about our conversation today is all the elements of your expertise, your willingness to be curious when you came across the gamified system in the very beginning when you went to the conference and said, hey, do you have data that shows the outcomes that we're getting here? And your willingness to partner to create opportunities for us to have a bigger impact in our space is something that is incredibly refreshing. But the other element of it as well is you're not a 20-something or a 30-something coming into this space. You have the track record and the proof and the experience to show why these technologies are necessary for us to be able to get out of the rock in a hard place problem that we're in our communities right now. So Dr. Ross, I just want to say, for everybody who's been watching and listening today, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The last thing that we do here on the show is we ask a question that came from our previous guest. And I think I know how you're going to answer this one. Their question was, what is one thing that you're doing that others in your space aren't? And how do you differentiate yourself from those other people?
So I'm an older guy, but throughout my entire career and to this day, I carry direct caseload. I work directly with kids. Have since I started working the field, and I have had two clients that I work literally. I do direct service with them. I have always kept my hand in teaching kids, because I want to be able to show you how to do it. And I don't want to do it from an ivory tower. I've read the research and literature, and we published some papers on this and blah, blah. Now let me show you how to do it. And because you can't tell me the kid can't learn it or the kid can't do it if I can show you they can, and I can show you how. So I've always been one of those. I want to put my money where my mouth is because that kid learning matters to me. I mean, I got this job out in Saudi Arabia years ago that I got asked to go see a kid who had some services, and they've been trying to teach the kid to put an object into a container for about 3 months. And they'd give the instruction, he wouldn't do it. They'd take his hand and they'd prompt him to do it and tell him to do it over again. And I watched a little bit, and I said, I think you're missing the fact that he finds your physical contact reinforcing. Like, no, he's trying to escape from the task. So, if you don't mind if I jump in. So I literally jump in. I say, put in. I take his hand. I take the object, put it in. As soon as he lets go into the thing, I grab his hands. I start shaking it, rubbing it. He's looking and smiling. I do this like 2 or 3 times. And then I say, put in. He picks it up, puts it in, and puts his hands out to me to get the physical contact. I said, you're missing this kid sliding under the table. You're pushing him back up. The kid's looking away. You're turning him back. He's making you give him physical contact like literally every 15, 20, 30 seconds. And you think he's distracted and trying to escape because you're evaluating what you think about him, not what his behavior causes you to do. And he's learned the effect of his behavior is to produce physical contact. But if he puts the object in, you say, good job, and you don't touch him. So from his point of view, you punish him for doing the right thing and reward him for doing these other things. You don't value putting it in. You value slouching under the table and looking away. And you don't see it. So the thing that I think you have to always be is, first of all, don't accept anybody's explanation for something that's not working. If it's not working, it's because whatever doing doesn't work. It's not the kid's fault. You never blame the learner. You always blame instruction. Something about what we're doing isn't working and accounts for whatever we're getting. If we change our behavior will change. And so I had early mentors who drilled that into me. And you never blame the learner. You blame the instruction. Not necessarily the instructor, but something the instructor is doing is not helping because that kid, again, in one teaching trial could find an object, but for 3 months, he couldn't pick it up and put it in. That makes no sense. And the thing that we have always got to be willing to be curious about, why are we seeing this and not that? Look for the disconfirming data. You have a hypothesis. There's always some data that either supports it or doesn't. If you can find data that doesn't, your hypothesis is wrong, and it's time for you to change what you think and what you do.
That's a wrap. That was beautiful. Robert, this has been amazing. I can't believe that we've been able to wind through this time so quickly. This has been so valuable for us to be able to understand what are the challenges that we're facing. How can we innovate in this space? Although we're innovating in this space, there are still challenges that come along with the technology. So once again, I just want to say thank you for doing everything that you're doing and leading the way, but also being willing to slow down, look back and see where we came from and think about a different path on how we can get to where we're going. So once again, everybody, for the Hart Hustle podcast, Dr. Robert Ross, thank you so much for coming on the show, man.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah. Take care. Thank you so much for having me.